The fastest way to start your season 0-1 is to ignore the waiver wire after your draft. So in this video, I'm going to show you the 5 players that you need to add right now if you actually want to win in week 1. If this is your first time here, I'm Joe. I've done over 1 billion views in sports over the last decade, but more importantly, I've helped thousands of people just like you win their fantasy league. But the way I structure these videos is always the same. First, I start every video with the top NFL news stories, and then I tell you why they matter for fantasy football so you're up to date, and that's just to deliver some value right off the bat. And then I answer my 5 favorite questions from the last video just to reward some positivity and smart questions in every video. But it's also a little bit of an engagement hack because the more comments that I get, the more YouTube will boost this video overall. And then I jump into today's one key topic, aka the reason that you click. The goal is always to deliver on every single click, so feel free to skip ahead if you need to, but let's jump right into today's news. Some good news out of Buffalo. Khalil Shakir returned to practice last week after recovering from that high ankle sprain. I like when teams handle it this way, so the Bills held him out for like an entire month, all of August, to get that ankle fully right before the season, so he's back now, and yeah, if we see a little bit of rust, I think that's probably to be expected, but Josh Allen definitely will be pumped to have his most reliable wideout ready for week 1. He's kind of sitting in that wide receiver 3-4 range with some PPR upside, but might be more important than people realize with Dalton Kincaid still really underwhelming for the most of his career so far, his young career. Let's get to some news out of Dallas. Trevon Diggs looks like he is on track to play on Thursday. It was kind of in doubt earlier this week, but he himself said that he's 75 to 80% in terms of the shot that he would play. So we'll see. I do think that is definitely notable to see that they were not listed on the injury report. So it looks like we are going to get Trevon Diggs out there against A.J. Brown. But if he's not full go, I don't know. This is an interesting one. I think that they're going to need him for sure. I think that this one shapes up to be a little bit of a rout for Philly, in my opinion. I think it's only a 7-point spread right now, though. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. On the other side, A.J. Brown, not listed on the injury report. So this is another one that we've been kind of monitoring, this hamstring injury, all of that. I think it's good that he was a full participant in practice, seems completely over the hamstring. So locked in for Thursday night against the Cowboys, and I think he's a pretty safe start in fantasy. Sean McVay expects Matthew Stafford to start in week 1 despite that back issue. It looks like he's been managing it in practice, but it's going to be something that they battle all season long. So I'm not super worried about it. He's probably more of like a 2 QB league type of player anyway. The matchup against Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter in week 1 could get pretty ugly fast if he's not mobile in the pocket, at least. A good defensive line there. So we'll see. I wanted to flag this on Chase Brown. It looks like they're going to be moving him around a little bit more, even splitting him out wide against some linebackers. So the receiving upside from Chase Brown wheels up there. They also restructured their run game a little bit more around his skill set, which says a lot. That doesn't mean he's suddenly going to become like Deebo Samuel or anything, but it does suggest more passing game usage. So I like that. And since he throws a ton in scoring position, neutral situations, all of that. So I'm still a big fan of Brown turning into kind of that featured RB1. And you can get him in the end of the second round, beginning of the third, right at the turn there. 2 quick ones before we get into some questions. Minnesota looks optimistic that Jalen Nailor is going to be ready for week 1. Addison suspended, Thielen's back, all that. But it's interesting to see if he can kind of slot into that wide receiver role or if we see Adam Thielen kind of take over that immediately. So a little bit of buzz there, but we will see how this one shakes out. I still think Nailor in particular is a pretty deep league stash at best right now. It looks like Landon Dickerson is trending towards playing in week 1, which is huge for the ground game for the defending champs. Philly, in general, if they end up leaning run heavy in the second half versus Dallas, this is big news for Saquon. All right, let's get into questions. Make sure you guys drop one below this video if you want yours answered next time. Solomon64885 says that you mentioned in 2 separate videos being high on DJ Moore and Devontae Adams. Which one do you prefer? Yeah, this is a good question. While I kind of buy the rebound in general for DJ Moore under Ben Johnson in particular, I think Devontae Adams is still the much better player with a higher ceiling, especially if Stafford gets back to full health. So I think Stafford in particular is very necessary to kind of get to that ceiling. But yeah, if I had to pick just one, I am grabbing Devontae Adams still pretty aggressively and trying to scoop him up in trades as well. All right, question number 2. Not sure about Dak. Wasn't he the popular breakout QB last year too and pretty average? Yeah, last year I think was a little bit of an anomaly for Dak in general. I think the offensive line played pretty poorly. The Cowboys just hired a new offensive line coach. They have a new first round player in that positional group up front again. So I think they've kind of addressed some things in the draft. Also, like CD, of course, was banged up most of the season last year. I don't know if he had trouble separating in general, but he wasn't at full strength for sure. So I think the addition for Pickens is kind of what's going to unlock this entire offense in general. Dak was like the QB4 in 2023, so I still stand behind some pretty big upside there. Week one's a tough one just against Philly in general. They're pretty good at defending the boundaries, but also kind of in the interior as well. They're actually one of the best teams at defending the deep plays downfield. So while I love Pickens and have been talking about him for most of the season, don't panic if he has like a tougher week one, just because that's basically what Philly's defense, I should say, is kind of built to stop. Question number 3 comes from Misty. Am I crazy for picking Jaden Daniels instead of stacking Burrow with Chase and Brown? Yeah, I mean, I think correlation is great. I've talked about that quite a bit on this channel, but I think you'll be fine. Burrow played like pretty flawlessly last season, like throwing all those touchdowns. I think there's a little bit of a regression there, but also like the floor that you're going to get from Daniels, I think is much better. So I prefer Daniels in a vacuum for sure. I'm not going to force correlation just to get a worse player, if that makes sense. Question number 4. Michael, I was able to draft Emeka and Golden in my draft. Which one do you feel is the better breakout candidate? In my hot take, Stephon Diggs returns to form and is a top 12 wide receiver, my favorite comeback candidate. I like the Diggs take quite a bit. I would love to see that personally. As someone that likes Stephon Diggs quite a bit, I would like to see that. Egbuka over Golden for sure. I think that Godwin's injury, the camp buzz, all of those things, I think just a better passing offense overall than Green Bay, who might skew a little bit more run heavy. Or at least we saw that at times last year. Yeah, I'm trying to have as much Egbuka exposure as possible, but I like both these guys. I love your strategy of trying to get some of these elite rookie wide receivers. We tend to see some breakouts from those too. So just having your chips on the board spread out a little bit, I think is a really good strategy. Packers wide receivers just for me are a little bit harder to predict, and Love hasn't always just like focused in on one guy, if that makes sense. Question number 5 from Natasha. Would you trade JSN for Tyler Warren and Tet McMillan, even if my tight end right now is Andrews? Feels like I'm paying a bit too much for a backup tight end. Yeah, I think this is an interesting one just because I think there's a chance that Tet McMillan outscores JSN. He might see more raw target volume in general, just based on what the scheme and projections look like. So I don't think that's a huge downgrade. And yeah, I'm not a big Mark Andrews guy in general. So I'm not certain that Tyler Warren wouldn't be a guy that ends up starting for you anyways. Yeah, I think that like Isaiah Likely, there's a lot there that could hurt Andrews. Maybe Andrews is just cooked, right? So I'm a big Warren fan. I think his value is pretty high in general, and I kind of like that trade. I think I would do that. Yeah. All right, let's jump into today's one key topic, aka 5 players you need to add now in fantasy football before week 1. Let's get into it. Let's go all the way over here so we give ourselves some room on the whiteboard and dive in. We're going to talk about 5 players today. The first one, I think, is someone we've talked about a decent amount, maybe not enough, just for like, I think the step that this offense could take this year in general. I am kind of a big fan of this quarterback in particular, maybe a backup quarterback at the beginning of the year in terms of your fantasy team, depending on your scoring. But I think over time, you're definitely going to be able to play him in certain matchups. It's Trevor Lawrence. Let's talk about Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence is owned in 33% of fantasy leagues right now. 33%. So let's talk about this. For a guy that I think just has taken a really long time to get there for us from a fantasy perspective, you might be a little bit hesitant. But Liam Cohen turned Baker into a QB1. I think that's kind of like the one thing that we should be talking about right off the bat. It's the QB whisperer. If someone can fix this, it's going to be Cohen, right? So if he ends up being anything like Baker, this might be one of those guys that isn't on the waiver wire for long, depending on how this start is. So I like it quite a bit. Obviously, the Bucs ranked number 1 in screenplay EPA last year. They funneled a massive amount of volume to wide receivers, even after losing Godwin and Evans. So in one of those situations where he just basically revived Baker Mayfield's career, he might be able to do it again with Trevor Lawrence. The Jaguars also brought in Grant Udinsky as OC, who's kind of like a Kevin O'Connell type of OC. He's like a play designer, someone that can kind of build around Cohen's vision. So I'm pretty bullish on Trevor in general, just with like this new situation. But also, like, the weapons are completely ridiculous, right? The weapons are wheels up now. Obviously, what they did in the draft, the number 2 overall pick on Travis Hunter. They got Diami Brown in there, obviously Brian Thomas Jr., but just the BTJ and then the like the number 2 pick on this type of player, like generational type of player, I think is really, really strong. So I think that, wow, that does not look like an H at all. Travis Hunter. So the true like two-way freak player, all of that, I still think that they're going to use him primarily at wide receiver to start. They definitely didn't draft him just to watch him play the majority of his snaps on defense, in my opinion. So decent tight ends in there too. Like the weapons are real strong on the passing game. So I would say last year, if we're going to say anything about it, I think he was pretty efficient in some chaos, right? So even with, I mean, I guess even while hurt for most of the year, Lawrence posted a career high 7.2 yards per attempt, 0.45 fantasy points per dropback. So he was one of just 16 quarterbacks to do that. He also averaged 3.2 rushing fantasy points per game. That's better than Baker, again, last year. And I think most people don't realize the upside that Lawrence still has on his legs, or on the ground, I should say. But he missed 7 games last year. So that's a tough one, right? The injuries, AC joints, and also a concussion. But it seems like he's back on track to being fully healthy and has participated all the way through camp. So I think the main thing here that we have to like ask ourselves is like, what if it just took a while? And what if this is the year? They've got for sure a top 10 wide receiver duo, a quarterback friendly scheme, and really just a super late round price tag in fantasy on a former number 1 overall pick, right? So I don't think Lawrence has ever had like a top like 12 ceiling performance. I guess not performance, just season in general. But now he's finally going to be able to walk into that, in my opinion. They have a pretty tough passing schedule. So early season, I think, is going to be a little bit of like getting his feet set. But I do think he's a guy that if he's on your bench, you may end up using him in some spots, especially if you went late quarterback anyway. I think he's kind of like a high upside QB2 that could turn into like a starter by like week 3, 4. So Trevor Lawrence, one of my first guys that I think you should grab on the waiver wire for specific rosters. Obviously, if you need a quarterback, I think he makes a lot of sense. But before we move on to number 2, I have a bit of a surprise for you guys. Since we're talking about making picks, I'm teaming up with DraftKings Pick 6 this year for week 1 to give you a shot at their biggest bag ever. Right now, all DraftKings Pick 6 customers can play for free for a shot at a cut of 1 million or more. You pick more or less on 6-player stats. Share it with your crew because the more people that play, the bigger the bag grows. And if you hit all 6, you're in for a share of over 1 million. So if you want to play along, download the DraftKings Pick 6 app, sign up using my promo code HOLKA, and claim your free token today. Let's build this bag together. Now, next player. I was just shocked at his ownership in terms of like how many people just passed on Hollywood Brown in drafts. 37.9% owned in fantasy drafts right now on fantasy rosters. So Hollywood Brown, I mean, I've been a pretty big fan of his in general from a daily fantasy perspective for quite some time. But let's talk about Hollywood Brown and why he's one of the better waiver pickups right now before week 1. So the shoulder injury last year was basically what wiped out his entire season. So if he's fully healthy, obviously last year he didn't return until like week 16, something like that. And then there was no Rashee Rice, none of that. I think now the opportunity is pretty wide open without Rashee Rice to start the year. I think why it kind of matters, though, is like he's really one of the only Chiefs wide receivers that has like locked in experience. So I'm in on him as like a potential pickup, see what happens type of thing. I think he's going to see massive usage right away. So massive early, I mean, he's at least going to get an opportunity to be a big part of this offense, right? Massive early season volume. And he's like one of these guys, too, that you could package in a trade as we get rolling here, too, right? So I think even though while like his production lagged a little bit last year, he was still running a ton of routes. I think there was intent to get him involved, and the Chiefs still want to get him to be a bigger part of this offense, in my opinion. The thing that's tough is Kansas City's schedule is pretty brutal, like probably like a bottom 3 in terms of like one of the toughest passing schedules in 2025. So I think in some ways that might help Hollywood Brown a little bit, Mahomes is going to need guys that can actually like separate, not just like some of these gadget guys or these downfield guys. So I kind of think that Hollywood Brown could back into more production just from being what he's always been, a really strong route runner. So there's some nuance there, but I think 37% owned is completely ridiculous. I think he just makes a really, really strong filler. If you need help at wide receiver earlier in the season, especially until Rice gets back, like we talked a little bit about like Kelsey, he's not my favorite draft pick, but if you just drafted him to flip him after like week 3 or 4, I think that you could probably say some of the same things about Hollywood Brown. So I'm in on that. And what I was going to say here was just like the KC schedule is like the one thing that like causes a little bit of pause, but I think it's too early to be too worried about that. Third guy. This is someone that, I mean, I guess you've probably already seen the thumbnail. So Adam Thielen, back as a Viking, someone that, again, I don't think like would have been as much on the radar if it wasn't for some of the injuries that the Vikings have right now. Obviously the suspension as well. I think there's just a decent amount of opportunity here for him to at least be like a guy that shouldn't be on waiver wire. He's 47% owned right now across fantasy leagues. So last year, I think what people don't realize is he had a wide receiver 21. That's really bad. Some days the writing is better than others. Wide receiver 21 finish down the stretch in terms of fantasy points per game, weeks 12 through 18. So he was usable in fantasy last year. And really was still earning targets, was scoring touchdowns, all of those things. So even like at like his age 35 body, that's definitely been banged up, he still kind of delivered like that top 24 wide receiver numbers during like the most important weeks of the entire season last year. So he gains a little bit of trust there for me. And then, like I said, age 35, he's still winning routes. I think he knows, like, he has a very good idea of what he's capable of at this time too. So I'm kind of interested in this. I think that like the setup in general still makes a lot of sense to start the year. So let's talk about the setup. Addison, 3-game suspension. I think the wide receiver role, like right out of the gate, maybe 2, maybe wide receiver. We'll see what happens with Jalen Naylor, but I think he steps right into that like that type of usage. So plug and play flex, I think, with at least like a short term spike potential, in at least like the very beginning of the season. So I'm in on that. I think like for me, the question is he like the most overlooked guy? I don't see a lot of hype on him right now, especially like with what he was able to do to end the season last year. Over his last 10 healthy games, 61.5 yards per game, 12.8 yards per catch. That's best since 2019, and over a 2-yard per route run end of his season. So I think he proved that if he can get some extra targets, that he can help you in his flex. And obviously, this Minnesota offense still is one that we want to have exposure to. So I'm in on that. Let's talk about a running back. We haven't talked about one running back on the waiver wire. This is the time of year where you still want to give yourself some upside in some of these ambiguous backfields. And the one that comes to mind for me, we talked about Trevor Lawrence, but what about Bashel Tutin? So the Jags coaching staff, which we already talked about. Let's zoom in a little bit here. All right. So Jags coaching staff. I think this is the time of the year too where a lot of people don't realize how much that can change a team and change it quickly, right? So Liam Cohen, same play caller that really unlocked not just Baker last year, but Bucky Irving last year, I think is super bullish for this running game. Cohen's scheme kind of turned Rachaad White into like a running back too, made Bucky Irving like definitely like a playoff workhorse. So it's not just all going towards Trevor Lawrence. I think that Bashal Tutin and this run game could definitely be one of those ones that could benefit from this move as well. So I think just looking at the profile of this player, he is the one that looks the most like a Bucky Irving type of player, right? Best in class, 4.32 40, and really just nice burst in general that he's shown at the combine. And I think that the highest, like the thing that I'm looking at is can they break tackles, avoid tackles at the college level? Because if they can't do it there, they're not going to do it in the pros, right? So he beat Bucky in particular in terms of his tackle rate avoided and his yards after catch per rush in college. And he's 14 pounds heavier. So I think that this is like an athlete that could be, at least in one of those situations where if he's on your waiver wire, it's kind of like a wait and see type of thing. Because if this backfield in general cracks open, there's going to be opportunity here. I think it's like one of the better ambiguous ones. And when I say that, what I mean is we don't know who's going to emerge from this. Is it going to be Travis Etienne? Maybe. Is it going to be Tank Bigsby? Maybe. But I think we've seen enough from those guys to know that they're not going to be like game breakers for your fantasy team. But I think Tutin has a chance to be this year's Bucky Irving. And he's a guy that I'm willing to wait on a little bit to see what we have there. So he's a guy that I'm going to be grabbing if he is on the waiver wire and wait and see. You might already have drafted him. I know that we've been kind of talking about him a decent amount. The last guy I want to talk about is someone that just is almost always overlooked. So we haven't talked about a tight end yet, but what about Hunter Henry? All this guy does is score touchdowns. All he does is score touchdowns. But last year, it wasn't just the touchdowns. This offense wasn't one that we were like targeting a ton in daily fantasy. But from a receiving standpoint, he led the Patriots in every major category. "66 catches, 674 yards, 97 targets, all career highs for Henry at age 30. And why that matters to me is that he was like the most reliable pass catcher. And yeah, bottom tier offense, but I don't think that role disappears just with Stephon Diggs being there now. And I think that like there's always going to be something to be said for the chemistry, and he was clearly May's favorite target. In May's 10 healthy games, Henry averaged 10.2 PPR points and earned a 21% target share. So rookie QBs always kind of lean on their tight ends a little bit more, but I think the trust that they've built is pretty real. And I think that that's going to transfer over to this year. He's 40% owned right now across fantasy leagues. So obviously the massive role, but minimal tight end or minimal TDs, I should say. So I always like forget like last year he didn't like score a ton. He scored twice, but he's due for kind of like we've seen the spectrum, right? We've seen him score a lot more touchdowns than that. So I think the touchdown regression thing is actually a positive because we have seen him do it before, just not last year. And I think the thing that we have to get at here, what we have to ask ourselves is like, what about if this New England offense actually takes off? Like we got Josh McDaniels back calling plays. May now has some real weapons to take a step. I like Drake May as like one of the better breakout opportunities at the quarterback position as well. And Henry's volume didn't drop a ton even after Diggs and the rookies were added in the preseason. So I think that this offense, even if it slightly rebounds, Hunter Henry's floor is still like a weekly streamer and his ceiling is low end tight end one. But if you haven't done your draft yet, you should check out my round by round breakdown here. Hit subscribe and we'll see you guys next time.